Seth, welcome to BookTV, and now is my chance to ask you all the questions I've wanted to ask as I've watched your career in the past few years. You have time on the ground in Afghanistan, you've got time advising the top special operations commanders both here and in the field, and you've been in the think tank world. So let's launch with your new book, Hunting in the Shadows. You talk about 3 waves of al-Qaeda violence and a possible third wave. Before we get into the evolution of how you've tracked that, how the U.S. intelligence and national security world has tracked that, can we talk about the health of the organization? We've just passed a major milestone with the 1-year anniversary of the Osama bin Laden raid. How are they doing?
Well, I think how is al-Qaeda doing depends on which part of the organization we're talking about. The core group based in Pakistan that was led by Osama bin Laden until he was killed a year ago, that organization has definitely struggled somewhat. It's lost a range of its senior operational leaders, religious leaders, and operatives. But it has survived to some degree. It still has some key founding members, including Ayman al-Zawahiri, involved in running the organization. Abu Yahya al-Libi is now the number 2. He's got a wealth of experience in North Africa and a range of other places. So the organization at the center has been weakened somewhat. But I think, as we'll talk about in a little bit, when you look out across its affiliates in places like Yemen, for example, it has arguably strengthened based on its levels of violence, its territorial control of on the ground, and a range of other factors. So part of the answer, I think, depends on which part of al-Qaeda in a group that is clearly decentralizing.
So let's talk about that evolution. Start us with the first wave, 9/11. What was the organization like then, and how were they able to launch those series of attacks?
Well, the first wave begins, group is formed in Pakistan in the late 1980s, and then over the course of the 1990s begins to build itself really as a hierarchical structure. Pulls in a number of individuals and groups from other locations, but particularly settles in Afghanistan, first in the Jalalabad area, and then in particular, bin Laden moves down to the Kandahar area, near Mullah Omar. The issues for al-Qaeda and what was going right at that point were several things. One, it had a sanctuary in Afghanistan, and it had an ally. It had an individual, Mullah Omar, with whom it had tense relationships at some point, but was a good enough host that it allowed bin Laden to stay and plan for operations. It also had a somewhat limited targeting structure, at least for the early period. It was primarily targeting U.S. military facilities, embassies, but not killing large numbers of civilians. So it targeted the USS Cole, the U.S. Embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya. And then as we got up to 9/11, it became clear that there was really no U.S. strategy, at least one that was executed on the ground against al-Qaeda. So it had a sanctuary, it had a limited, selective engagement strategy of killing minimal civilians, and it had an enemy who had not identified it as a major threat. I mean, it had some people, but the administration in general had not identified it as a major threat.
So it was at that point seen as an organization that had a means to attack us abroad, but not at home, and were they still just not taking it seriously enough?
Well, there clearly were some individuals. I mean, we know even from the 9/11 Commission report and a range of individuals I talked to at organizations like the CIA, including the bin Laden unit at the CIA, that identified bin Laden, had identified grave concerns about plotting attacks in the West, including in the United States. We know that a range of individuals like Richard Clarke were ringing alarm bells at the White House level. But again, at that point, when we go back and look, the administration at that point was focused on things like the Balkans and the Kosovo War, which was 1999. So issues other than
putting out fires elsewhere
exactly.
in the national security arena. Now, you talk about this wave of al-Qaeda violence, and then they get beaten back, sometimes because of their own actions. What caused the kind of temporary defeat the first time? Was it our launch into Afghanistan?
Well, actually, it's almost the reverse of the coin we just outlined. They lost that sanctuary in Afghanistan, so the host they had, the Taliban regime, was overthrown. And in addition to that, we saw a U.S. approach that was focused mostly on clandestine services, the CIA, the range of other intelligence services, NSA, geospatial, and then special operations forces targeting in Afghanistan and then in Pakistan and other locations.
You're talking about in 2001 how the U.S. fought back by sending in CIA and Special Forces Green Berets working together on the ground in Afghanistan with the tribal leaders and driving the Taliban out?
In addition to what was going on in other locations, so the capture of individuals like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in Pakistan, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, Abu Zubaydah, who not quite an al-Qaeda person himself, but definitely involved in operations, Abu Faraj al-Libi. So these operations, even in countries like Pakistan, were done with clandestine units working during that period closely with the Pakistanis. And then, in addition, al-Qaeda had, in killing a large number of civilians in New York City, it did lead to a backlash in some areas of the world, especially among some conservative Sunnis, that this was probably going too far.
I was going to ask you about that. You go into great detail in the book about the intellectual debate back and forth between Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's the current leader of al-Qaeda, replacing bin Laden, with his old mentor turned enemy, Sheikh Sharif in Egypt. So you had two former militants in arms who are battling it back and forth. Can you describe that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting evolution of a relationship. Sharif and Zawahiri went back to the early years in Egypt. They were both practicing doctors, had both been involved in the early years of the establishment of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, had both gone to Pakistan together, and established an EIJ that was becoming a little bit more global, an Egyptian Islamic Jihad that was becoming a little bit more global in focus. Sharif ran the organization. Zawahiri was his deputy. Sharif was particularly important because he established a lot of the important ideological underpinnings of Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Some of the stuff he wrote was used at some of the early al-Qaeda training camps. But over the next several years, they had a falling out. Part of it was personality-based. Part of it was Sharif was deeply upset at what Zawahiri did in one of his books, editing it in a way that he thought was wrong. And then it does appear that Sharif begins to have second thoughts about the use of violence in the way that Zawahiri continued to push. Armed opposition against the Egyptian regime, and then just this broadening view of killing civilians, including Muslims, that Sharif ultimately just could not accept as valid.
Now, you talk about your frustration that the U.S. government didn't take advantage of that schism between the two sides. How could the U.S. have picked up those messages and reflected them out to the wider Islamic world without, in a way, tainting them by backing them? I know that's a lot of times the U.S. officials are like, well, if we embrace this person, we just turn them into an enemy of al-Qaeda.
Well, I think the issue is less the U.S. getting directly involved in most cases, because I think when the U.S. gets directly involved in backing individuals, including conservative Sunni Muslims in this case, it tends to undermine them.
We taint them.
Exactly, we taint them. I think the issue rather is the story, the debate, which spread among a number of global jihadists who backed Zawahiri, and a number of very conservative Sunni Muslims, clerics who backed Sharif, or Dr. Fadl as he's often known. I think the issue was, with one or two minor exceptions, most Americans and most people overseas saw very little of that debate.